Good morning. My name is Preston Miller, and I am the high school director here at First Presbyterian Church. And I was actually baptized 25 years ago in that baptismal font. I was confirmed on those steps, and 7 years ago, as a senior in high school, I preached a sermon from this pulpit. With my job as the high school director, I get to do a lot of fun things like teaching Sunday schools, leading small groups, taking kids on retreats and mission trips, starting cool leadership teams like SALT. But my absolute favorite part of my job is taking students out to meals and having real conversations with them. During those meals, we get to talk about their hopes and their dreams. And we also get to talk about their doubts and their fears, and sometimes even their failures. Today, I want to ask you guys a question. How does Jesus respond to those times when we fail? To start off, I want everyone to imagine that you are living the life of a man named Peter. And we're going back to the very beginning. You're born in a small town off the Sea of Galilee, and your entire childhood, teenage years, and college years are all spent fishing. There, we set the scene, on that same Sea of Galilee. You go out fishing, and the night is a complete failure. Cast after cast, you don't catch anything. You eventually give up, you go back to that shoreline, and you start cleaning your nets. While you're there, you hear a voice. There's a man telling you to go back into the water and cast your nets. You listen, maybe begrudgingly, but you row back into the water and you cast your nets. And suddenly, fish start pouring in. So many fish that you have to call for help to bring it back to the shoreline. After all the hustle and excitement of bringing in this insane catch, you remember the man. What would be your reaction to him? Would you be grateful? Would you be scared? If you remember the story, Peter falls to his knees. He looks at Jesus and he says, "Depart from me, for I am a sinner." To some of us, that might seem like an obscure reaction, but Peter had grown up learning the scriptures. He knew that God was a holy God, and here, Peter was standing in front of him. The memories of his sin and his past began to all flood down on him all at once. He was being completely honest and vulnerable when he said, "Depart from me." But notice how Jesus responds to Peter. In Luke 5, verse 10, he says, "Do not be afraid. From now on, you will be catching men." Jesus doesn't depart from Peter. He sees Peter's past, and he invites him into work. He says, "Come and be my disciple." Peter's story starts with a failure. He's worked all night. He's used his hard-earned skills and all of his talents, all for nothing. Peter doesn't succeed until Jesus calls him into his purpose and his work. We fast forward 2 years of Peter living his life tethered to Jesus' hip. During this time, he gets a front row seat to witness almost all of Jesus' miracles. He becomes a part of the inner three. Jesus heals his mother-in-law. Peter walks on water and sees Jesus feed the 5,000. At this point, Peter has more information and experience of who Jesus is than almost anyone alive on the planet. After all of this experience, we get to Matthew chapter 16, in which we read about a time where Jesus got to have one of those real and honest conversations with his disciples. Just like I get dinners with my students and get to ask them real questions, Jesus asked the disciples a real question. Jesus said, "Who do the people say that I am?" The disciples answered and said, "Some say John the Baptist, some Elijah, and others Jeremiah or one of the prophets." But if you notice, no one on the planet got it right. At that time, no one truly recognized who Jesus was. But Peter then gets asked a question by Jesus. Jesus turns to the disciples and he says, "Who do you say that I am?" Peter nails it. He answers and he says, "You are the Messiah, the Son of God." And Jesus actually responds in a way that shows us how this interaction happens. He says, "You are blessed, Simon, son of John, because my Father in heaven has revealed this to you. You did not learn this from any human being." Peter didn't figure it out on his own. He didn't reason or think his way to this conclusion. He didn't earn it by his actions or by being a good disciple. God himself revealed it to him. He had known Jesus for 2 years up to this point, but the knowledge of who Jesus was had finally moved down into his heart. Peter responds to him with a blessing. He says, "Now I say to you, you are Peter," which means rock. "And upon this rock I will build my church, and all the powers of hell will not conquer it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven." Look at how far Peter has come. That same poor fisherman who grew up on the Sea of Galilee, the same person who said, "Depart from me," has now received the keys to the kingdom. Jesus is going to build his church on this rock. If you were Peter, wouldn't you feel on top of the world at this moment? Really imagine if all of the powers of hell could not conquer you. Some months after this, Jesus sits Peter and the disciples down once again, and he has yet another real conversation with them. In Matthew 26, Jesus tells them that Easter is coming, that soon he will be crucified and buried, that Peter and the disciples will scatter from him. How would you respond? Peter's heart takes over. He pushes back against Jesus, and he cries out, "Even if everyone else deserts you, I will never depart from you." But Jesus looks at Peter right in that moment, and he tells him, "Truly I tell you, Peter, before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times." Peter fought back. This was his best friend. Peter said, "Even if I have to die with you, I will never depart from you." Just after that, Jesus takes the disciples to the Garden of Gethsemane, and there he's betrayed. He's taken and he's arrested, and the disciples scatter. But Peter, to his credit, follows Jesus. He made a promise. He goes all the way to the courtyard of the high priest, but he never has the confidence to go all the way in. While he's in that courtyard, he begins to warm himself next to a charcoal fire. And don't we all have our charcoal fires? The places or the things that we go to in the midst of uncertainty, the things that make us feel warm. It might be a habit, a person, or a substance. Right by that fire, Peter's recognized by a little girl, and he's asked the question, "Do you know Jesus?" And in that moment, Jesus' prediction comes true. Peter, the rock, crumbles. He responds to the little girl, and he says, "I do not know him." He stays by that fire, and eventually a servant sees him. The servant comes up, and he asks, "Hey, didn't I see you in the garden with Jesus?" And Peter denies Jesus again. The gates of hell didn't overcome Peter. A servant did, with a simple question. Finally, some bystanders in the crowd go up to Peter, and they say, "Hey, aren't you Galilean? Don't you know Jesus?" And Peter, the man with the keys to the kingdom, yells at him. He says, "Man, I don't know what you're talking about." Right in that moment, the rooster crowed. In Jesus' hardest and final moments, Peter failed. He broke his promise, and he departed from Jesus. Luke's gospel gives us a specific, heartbreaking detail about that story. Right after Peter denies Jesus the third time, Jesus turns and he looks directly at Peter. Really sit with that detail. The last thing Peter saw before Jesus was crucified and buried was Jesus looking at him, right in the moment of his worst failure. Maybe you know what that feels like. The burden of being seen in your brokenness. What do you think was going on in Peter's mind? He didn't know what to do. At this point, Jesus was gone, and he had this massive failure looming over him. So he returned to the only comfort zone he knew. He got his buddies, he went back to that same Sea of Galilee, and in John chapter 1, verse 3, he says, "I'm going fishing." "We'll come too," the disciples all said. So they went out into the boat, but they caught nothing all night. Sound familiar? At dawn, Jesus was standing on the beach, but the disciples couldn't see who he was. He called out, "Fellows, have you caught any fish?" "No," they replied. Then he said, "Throw out your net on the right-hand side of the boat, and you'll get some." So they did, and they couldn't haul in the net because there were so many fish in it. Sound familiar? Then the disciple Jesus loved said to Peter, "It is the Lord." When Simon Peter heard it was the Lord, he put on his tunic, jumped into the water, and headed to the shore. When they got there, they found breakfast waiting for them. Fish cooking over a charcoal fire. Sound familiar? Bring some of the fish you've just caught, Jesus said. So Simon Peter went aboard and dragged the net to the shore. There were 153 large fish, and yet the net hadn't torn. Now, come and have some breakfast, Jesus said. Then Jesus served them the bread and the fish. So, how does Jesus respond to Peter's failure? He met them on the same shoreline where it all started. He performed the same miracle with the catch of the fish, and he didn't stop there. He went on to cook them breakfast and to eat with them. Really think about that. In the midst of Peter's failure, the creator of the universe met him with the breaking of bread. They had fished all night and caught nothing. They had failed and scattered from Jesus. Yet he met them with crucified hands that had already cleaned and cooked the fish so that they could eat together once again. Think of Peter's situation, how he might have been feeling, and then the immediate relief you feel walking into a good meal. How stress, anxieties, and worries fade away with good company. Breaking bread is the greatest discipling tactic in the world. That's how Jesus connects with the disciples and Peter before he ever says a word about their actions. I really want us to pay attention to the details of the passage because it appears that Jesus is recreating the entire scene of Peter's life with Jesus so far. Think of it. It's the same Sea of Galilee, the same catch of fish, and the same kind of charcoal fire. Jesus is always intentional with the details. There's a reason he first met Peter on that shore. There's a reason Jesus called Peter to be a catcher of men. And there's a reason he gave him the keys. Jesus knew that Peter would deny him. But regardless of Peter's failures, he had eternal work for him to do. Jesus doesn't just ignore Peter's denial, he flips it in only a way that Jesus can do. Once again, over a meal, he gets to have another real conversation with Peter. Jesus says, verse 15, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" Notice how Jesus gets Peter to return to obedience. He doesn't interrogate Peter about his failures. He doesn't get angry or say, "I told you so." Instead, he asks a question. Do you love me more than these? What's interesting is that no one really agrees on what the these are when Jesus asks the question, what are these? Some scholars guess that Jesus was talking about the boats. Some people guess that they were talking about the 153 fish the disciples had got. Or some even go on to guess that it's about Peter's fixation on his failures. But regardless of what the these are, Jesus is calling out the idols in Peter's heart, not his failures or his actions. He's calling out the things of the world that Peter turns to for comfort and security outside of Jesus. To make this personal, for me, it would have been really easy for Jesus to show up with a list of all the times that I've stumbled. He could have given me a list that would wrap around the baptismal font, gone down the stairs, and met me in this pulpit. But Jesus doesn't come with a list. He came to me at this very church, my Sea of Galilee, and he put people in my life. Shepherds that would take me out to meals and have real conversations with me. The meals weren't about my shortcomings, they weren't about my actions. They were about having a real relationship with people like Ed Moore, who could ask me the simple question, has anyone told you today that they love you? Or, who do you say that Jesus is? Do you love him more than your these? For me, the these and my idols were specific things: security, control, the ability to plan my future. I cared so much about what I could achieve for myself. For us, that question might look like, do you love Jesus more than your status? Do you love Jesus more than your performance or your busyness? Or simply, do you love Jesus more than the things of this world? Look at the beauty of how restoration works. In our failures, Jesus treats me just as Ed treated me. He's a relational God. He doesn't bring up a list and shove it in our face. He brings up our hearts. He strips away the things of this world and asks us to turn our eyes off of our failures and to do the most important thing we can in our life, to turn our eyes upon Jesus. Once that realignment happens, once Peter says, "Yes, Lord, you know I love you," then Jesus gives him the commission. He takes Peter's failure and he turns it into Peter's purpose. He says, "Then feed my lambs, then take care of my sheep, then feed my sheep." He finishes by giving Peter the same calling as when it all started. From now on, Peter was back to being a catcher of man. And even more, he was a shepherd of man, not the failure who departed and couldn't catch a single fish. Because of Jesus, he was now restored. Peter got to learn firsthand that forgiven people become gentle shepherds, that lost sheep know where to find other lost sheep. So, for the last time, I want everyone to put themselves back into the shoes of Peter. Maybe you feel like Peter when he was first standing on the shore, and you think your list prevents Jesus from showing up and having work for you to do. Maybe you feel like Peter when he was first handed the keys, and your relationship with Jesus is based off what you've achieved. Maybe you feel like Peter standing by the charcoal fire, and you're in a place of uncertainty, and it seems that the fire of a substance, person, or a place will keep you warm. Maybe Jesus is just asking you the simple question, do you love me? How does Jesus respond to our times of failure? He sees them, but he chose to bear them on the cross. He chose to be abandoned by God so that he could meet us with crucified hands that have already prepared the table. Peter finally understood that, and now he could tell his story differently. Whether it was by a charcoal fire or by a shoreline, it was no longer about his failures. It was about his Savior who relentlessly pursued him again and again in the midst of his brokenness. Peter was now able to be the rock because his foundation was no longer his own. It was Jesus alone. Now, Peter was back to being a shepherd. He could go and sit people down and have those real conversations that change lives. Whether it was preaching to 3,000 people at Pentecost, or just having a simple conversation with one Roman centurion in a home, Peter understood that the breaking of bread is the greatest discipling tactic of all time. That Jesus can turn our failures into his purpose. And it all starts with a simple question. We have to ask ourselves again and again, do you love Jesus? If so, take your brokenness and go and feed his sheep. We need shepherds. Will you pray with me? Dear God, thank you so much for your grace. Thank you so much for your relentless pursuit in the midst of our failures. I thank you so much for the life of Peter, but more than that, I thank you for your son, Jesus. I thank you for the cross and the invitation to the table. I say all these things in Jesus' name. Amen.
When Jesus revealed himself to his disciples on the Sea of Galilee, he didn't do it with a sermon. He didn't do it with a podcast. He didn't do it with a lesson, and he didn't even do it with a list of things to do or a list of problems that perhaps were had in the past. No, he did it with a meal. He came with a meal because a meal represents two things to us. If you listen to this story, it's full of details. Charcoal fire, fish, nets, water, all of these things that remind us of the reality of this situation. And a meal reminds us that Jesus was really alive. This bread and this cup remind us that he is as real